Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this debate on one of the most pressing topics in Bangladesh today, election versus reformation. The nation is at a crossroads, with some arguing that elections should take place first to establish legitimacy, while others insist that socioeconomic and institutional reforms must precede elections to ensure long-term stability. The motion for today's debate is, without socioeconomic and institutional reforms, an election cannot ensure long-term development for the country. Arguing for the motion is Arpita Rahman.
I am Arpita Rahman, and I will be speaking for the motion, Reforms Must Precede Elections to Ensure Sustainable Development in Bangladesh.
And arguing against the motion is Abir Chowdhury.
I am Abir Chowdhury, and I will be speaking against the motion, Elections Must Follow Reforms.
The debate will follow a structured format. In the first 3 rounds, each participant will present their arguments and counter-arguments. The final round will be a Q&A exchange, where both will ask and answer questions to challenge each other's positions. We, the audience, will listen to their points carefully and decide which side makes a stronger case. Let the debate begin.
Good evening, everyone. I firmly believe that socioeconomic and institutional reforms must precede elections if we are to achieve sustainable development and a truly democratic system. Elections, while essential to democracy, cannot function effectively if the foundations of our institutions remain weak and plagued by corruption and inefficiency. Without reforms, elections risk perpetuating the same broken systems that have led us to this political crisis in the first place. For instance, public institutions today lack transparency and accountability. If we rush into elections without addressing these issues, the outcomes may lack credibility and further erode trust in governance. Moreover, widespread socioeconomic disparities mean that a significant portion of our population is unable to engage meaningfully in the democratic process. Reforms aimed at reducing inequality, enhancing education, and ensuring fair access to resources will empower citizens to participate fully. Delaying elections in favor of reforms is not a step backward. It's a necessary investment in a stable, inclusive, and sustainable future. Only through these reforms can we create the conditions for elections that truly reflect the will of the people. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I strongly believe that elections must take place before socioeconomic and institutional reforms, because only an elected government has the legitimacy and public mandate necessary to carry out meaningful reforms. Delaying elections under the guise of reform risks creating a dangerous precedent where unelected bodies dictate the future of our nation. The longer we wait for elections, the more we undermine the core principles of democracy. Reforms without a government chosen by the people lack legitimacy and accountability. Additionally, who decides what reforms are necessary and in whose interest? An unelected interim government lacks the mandate to make these crucial decisions for the entire country. Furthermore, the absence of an elected government during prolonged reform periods can lead to political instability and public discontent. Elections provide a platform for addressing grievances, ensuring representation, and reestablishing trust in governance. Immediate elections will create a legitimate foundation upon which reforms can be implemented with the support of the people. In conclusion, elections are not just a process. They are the cornerstone of democracy. Reforms can and should follow, but they must be led by a government that reflects the will of the people. Thank you.
Let me strengthen my point with examples. Look at countries like Tunisia after the Arab Spring. They rushed into elections without addressing systemic issues like corruption and weak institutions. As a result, political instability persisted, and the same elite groups retained control. Contrast this with South Africa, where significant institutional reforms were made before elections post-apartheid, ensuring a stronger and more inclusive democracy. In our own context, think about the public discontent caused by the lack of accountability in our institutions. Without reform, how can we expect a fair election? The interim government has the unique opportunity to implement changes, like introducing transparency in election funding or strengthening the judiciary, that will create a fair playing field for all parties. Moreover, socioeconomic inequality remains a massive barrier. For example, in rural areas of Bangladesh, Many voters are influenced by money or misinformation due to a lack of education and economic security. If reforms like better voter education programs or stricter controls on campaign financing are implemented, the integrity of elections will improve dramatically. These examples show that reforms are not just theoretical, they have proven to lay the groundwork for sustainable democratic processes worldwide. Thank you.
Let me clarify why elections must come first, supported by examples. Consider post-war Germany in 1949. The country was in ruins, yet elections were held first to establish a legitimate government. That government, chosen by the people, then spearheaded reforms that rebuilt the nation. Similarly, in India after independence, elections were prioritized even though the country faced socioeconomic challenges like poverty and illiteracy. Those elected governments then drove policies that transformed the nation over decades. In contrast, look at countries like Libya after the fall of Gaddafi. Prolonged interim rule without elections created a power vacuum and worsened instability. Delaying elections undermines trust in governance, allowing factions to exploit the situation for their gain. In Bangladesh, an unelected interim government making reforms could face significant pushback from political parties and the public, questioning its legitimacy. For example, if controversial reforms like land redistribution or electoral funding laws are implemented without a public mandate, they may lead to unrest or be overturned by future governments. Immediate elections can restore stability by giving people the power to choose their representatives. This public mandate is crucial for implementing reforms that are widely accepted and sustainable. History shows us that elections pave the way for progress, not the other way around. Thank you.
While my opponent has cited examples like post-war Germany and India, these cases actually strengthen my point. In both situations, the nations had foundational structures that could support elections. Germany had the Allied powers overseeing the process and providing stability, while India had the framework of British parliamentary institutions to build upon. Bangladesh, on the other hand, is grappling with institutional corruption, weak governance, and deep socioeconomic inequality, issues that elections alone cannot resolve. My opponent also mentioned Libya, but that example demonstrates the dangers of rushing into governance without stable institutions. Libya's interim period failed because there were no reforms to address tribal divisions or institutional weaknesses. Similarly, in Bangladesh, holding elections without reform risks perpetuating the same systemic issues that have caused political instability for years. He argues that an interim government lacks legitimacy to carry out reforms. But isn't the current interim government already tasked with rebuilding trust? Reforms such as ensuring election transparency, implementing voter education programs, and strengthening anti-corruption measures will build the public's confidence in the election process. These reforms are urgent and necessary to make elections credible. Elections without reform will only deepen divisions and fail to create the stability he speaks of. Reforms lay the groundwork for a democracy that works for everyone, not just the powerful few. Thank you.
Thank you. My opponent has raised concerns about institutional weaknesses and socioeconomic inequality, but her argument assumes that an unelected interim government is better equipped to address these issues than a government with the mandate of the people. History shows us otherwise. Reforms implemented by unelected bodies often lack legitimacy and public support, making them unsustainable. For instance, Egypt's interim governments after the Arab Spring attempted reforms, but without a public mandate, those efforts faltered, leading to further unrest. She cited Libya's instability as a result of rushing governance, but Libya's true failure was the lack of elections to establish legitimacy and order. In Bangladesh, delaying elections could create a similar power vacuum, fostering even more uncertainty and unrest. My opponent assumes that reforms can occur in isolation, but in reality, an elected government is needed to implement and sustain reforms with public accountability. Regarding voter education and anti-corruption reforms, these can be initiated by an elected government. Without elections, how do we ensure these reforms reflect the people's priorities? Elections are not just a symbolic process, they provide the foundation for legitimacy, which is essential for any reform to succeed. In conclusion, reform should follow elections, not precede them. Only an elected government can truly represent the people's will and execute reforms that are widely accepted and effective. Thank you.
Abir, you mentioned that elections are necessary for legitimacy. But how can an election held under weak institutions and corrupt practices provide true legitimacy? Isn't it more likely that such an election will be contested, leading to further instability?
Thank you, Arpita. Elections, even under imperfect systems, give people a voice and establish a baseline for legitimacy. Interim governments lack public accountability, so why should people trust them to carry out reforms without bias? My question to you, if reforms are delayed for years, what ensures that the interim government doesn't become authoritarian?
Abir, reforms don't need years, they need focused effort. The interim government has no incentive to stay in power indefinitely because its sole purpose is to pave the way for fair elections. How can you guarantee that rushing elections without addressing foundational issues won't lead to the same political gridlock we've seen before?
Rushing is not the issue, Arpita. Elections are urgent to restore public trust and stability. Without elections, the interim government risks losing credibility. Isn't it better to elect leaders who have the public's mandate to decide on reforms rather than leaving such decisions to unelected officials?
Elected leaders often come from the same corrupt systems that reforms aim to dismantle. Isn't it necessary to fix those systems first so the elections truly reflect the will of the people rather than the power of political elites?
Fair point, but systemic reform is an ongoing process, not a prerequisite for elections. Elections provide the platform for the people to choose leaders who can spearhead those reforms with legitimacy. Can an unelected body ever match that level of accountability?
Today, we've discussed why reforms must precede elections to ensure a stable and fair democracy. Elections without addressing systemic corruption and inequality risk repeating the same cycles of instability and disillusionment. Reforms will pave the way for free and credible elections, restoring trust in governance. Let's prioritize the long-term well-being of our nation. Vote for reforms first, vote for stability. Thank you.
Elections are the foundation of democracy. Delaying them for reforms creates a dangerous precedent and undermines public trust. Only an elected government, chosen by the people, has the legitimacy and accountability to implement meaningful reforms. Let us trust the democratic process and move forward together. Vote for elections first. Vote for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this debate. Now it's your turn to decide. Should elections come first or should reforms take priority? Comment below with your opinion and let us know which side you support. Your voice matters in this discussion. Thank you.